Okay, here's a question for you. Why would a country, a totally independent nation with its own flag, its own laws, its own identity, ever choose to just give up some of its power? It's a huge question, and it really gets to the heart of how our world is put together today. I mean, think about it. Why would a sovereign state voluntarily join a bigger club and agree to play by rules it didn't write all by itself? It kind of sounds backward, right? But this very process has completely shaped modern history. And the reasons why it happens, well, they all started with one massive, terrifying problem. You see, for as long as there have been nations, there's been war. And for almost just as long, some of the smartest people around have been trying to figure out how to break that cycle for good. The dream wasn't just about winning the next war. It was about creating a world where war itself becomes, well, impossible. And this wasn't just some philosophical daydream. It became an absolutely desperate necessity.
All right, so let's take a look at the catastrophe that really lit a fire under this whole debate and turned it from an idea into an urgent, real-world project. To put it bluntly, the first half of the 20th century was an absolute bloodbath. You had World War I, then the total failure of the League of Nations to stop aggression, and then the even bigger horror of World War II. All of this proved a really terrifying point. If you just leave nations to do their own thing, driven by super intense nationalism, it can literally lead to global self-destruction. Something had to change, and fast. Right, so the horrors of World War I, they weren't just some historical event. They were an engine for brand new political ideas. This whole search for a different way to organize the world, it wasn't born in a comfortable university library. It was born directly from the mud and the chaos of the trenches. So, in the wake of all this destruction, this new urgency gave rise to three major schools of thought. Three competing blueprints, really, for how to build a lasting peace. We can think of them as the original pre-theories of integration. The first big idea was federalism, and the thinking here was incredibly bold, very direct. If separate nations keep causing wars, hey, let's just create one big new nation, a United States of Europe. The plan was to push power upwards to a brand new central government that would make the big decisions for everyone. It's kind of like deciding to stop fighting with your neighbors by just tearing down all the fences and building one giant house for everyone to live in together. Then you've got functionalism, which took the exact opposite approach. The functionalists basically said, whoa, hold on, a giant superstate? That sounds an awful lot like the old nationalism, just on a bigger scale. Let's start small. Their idea was to forget about politics and borders at first and just focus on practical, technical problems that everyone shares. Things like coordinating railroads or managing coal supplies. The theory was, if you can get nations to solve these small problems together, they'll start to build trust, and over time, their economies will get so tangled up that going to war would just become completely illogical.
So the key takeaway here is really the direction of travel. Federalists wanted a top-down solution, one big, bold political leap of faith to create a new central power. Power goes up. But the functionalists, they favored a sideways approach, a slow, gradual weaving together of interests through technical cooperation, hoping to make borders less and less important over time without some big political drama. Power goes out. And then there was a third idea, transactionalism, which offered a totally different path. This one wasn't about governments or technical agencies, it was about people. The idea here is actually pretty simple. The more that people from different countries talk to each other, trade with each other, and visit each other's homes, the more they'll start to see each other as, fellow humans, not just the enemy. This would build what they called a security community, a group of people with such a strong sense of shared identity that war just isn't even on the table anymore. Okay, so we've got these three competing ideas floating around. Now let's see how they actually played out in the real world, in what is probably the single biggest integration experiment in all of human history. The European Union. So when post-war Europe started to rebuild, which path did they take? Well, it kicked off with pure functionalism. In 1952, 6 countries, including historic enemies France and Germany, created the European Coal and Steel Community. By pooling the exact resources you need to build tanks and guns, they made it physically harder to go to war with each other. It worked, and that success led to a bigger economic community, and eventually, decades down the road, to the much more political European Union we know today. But here's the thing. Creating the EU didn't actually settle the argument. Nope. It just changed the terms of the debate. And it's a debate that is absolutely still raging today.
So this brings us to the modern version of that old debate. On one side, you have the neo-functionalists. They argue that this whole process has a life of its own, that when you cooperate on one thing, like trade, it creates a need to cooperate on another, like product safety rules, in a process they call spillover. And they say that power just inevitably flows towards shared institutions like the EU Commission. But on the other side, you've got the intergovernmentalists, and they argue, no way. They say national governments are always in the driver's seat, making smart, calculated decisions and never, ever giving up their ultimate control.
So what you end up with is this constant tug of war. It's really the original conflict all over again. The federalist stream of a single, unified community pulling in one direction, and the powerful, persistent reality of 27 separate, independent nations pulling in the other, each with its own interests and its own identity. That tension, that's the real drama of European integration.
And you know, all of this brings us right back to our big question, but with a modern twist. In a world that's facing huge challenges that no single country can possibly solve on its own, I'm talking about climate change, pandemics, global financial shocks, is the whole idea of a completely independent nation-state still workable? Or is some form of integration, some surrender of power, not just a choice anymore, but a flat-out necessity for survival? Now that is something to think about.